Welcome back for part 2 of our conversations about how and when to pivot your organization. Let's hop back in. Some of the clients we work with who have projections or have a vision that ultimately don't materialize. So I was thinking about, when we're thinking about that vision, Randall, maybe you want to speak to, what is the intel, what is the data or the gut, the gut plays into everything, how are you making that decision to pivot one way or the other?
Okay, so I think that the best laid plans of mice and men, not everything will always be successful, right? And when for whatever reason, the numbers are not coming down the way they should, there's this shorter term tactical question. Okay, what's going on here, right? Maybe it's the wrong salespeople, or the wrong delivery people, or maybe it's a little bit more fundamental. The market has shifted underneath us. Okay, or maybe it's something like, oh, we thought we were competitively different, but the new competitors come in with a slightly different value proposition. Maybe the pricing is different, but it's a shorter term kind of thing that the leaders should say, aha, our North Star, our vision, our what we're doing, that we still believe in, but we need to make some changes along the way to now properly march towards it. I think there's this whole conversations about pivoting, which is, yeah, you're making these little short-term things, but maybe the goal should be different too. And I think that that's the tougher job of leaders to say, you know something, our North Star is now 30 degrees to the right or to the left. And it's not a flippant quick decision, right? Unless it's an emergency, right? Where if it is, it's back to the tactics. But I think that's kind of where a lot of the work needs to be done. Um, um, I could probably go on with that one a little bit more, but I think that's really the most important point. The difference of if things aren't going as planned, what is actually happening that needs to be the short-term fixes, as opposed to, okay, is it really demonstrative of the need to do a wholesale pivot, a strategic pivot? I do just want to add one other thing to what you said. That third thing, what have we learned, or what can we learn so that we can avoid this in the past? That speaks to the importance of becoming a learning organization, right? Rather than everyone just doing what they're told, but everyone actually using their brains to figure it out, to incorporate continuing professional development with in the organization. So you don't have an organization of drones, but you've got an organization of creators who aren't the victims, if you will, but are actually moving the entire enterprise forward. We want an organization filled with a whole bunch of speedboat captains, right? And if the leadership says this is where we're going in this one particular direction, all the speedboat captains will know, okay, we're going in that particular direction. But hopefully, if it's a learning organization, they'll be tooled up to do so. And sometimes organizations say they are, but they aren't. And that's something that, particularly if you're looking to pivot, is absolutely important. And I'll just say why it's important. If an organization is truly going to be successful pivoting, it rests on what the staff are actually doing, what every single team member is doing. If you're moving, for example, from a professional services model to a SaaS model, guess what? Professional services, everyone's used to selling time by the hour. SaaS, thank you very much. There's client service, and there's uptime, and there's a development of a knowledge base, and there's like a completely different internal mindset that the same people, the ones who are successful, the ones who are responsible for your success in the past, have to suddenly be retooled to work on that pivoted business. And that won't happen successfully unless the people within the organization actually are smart enough to make that pivot in their own roles too, right? And that's the reason why building the learning organization is so important, because it makes the likelihood of a successful pivot far more likely.
The concept of pivoting strikes me, as you explain this last little segment, is that assumes that we're pivoting from something to something. It's sort of built into the word definition of the word pivot, that we're going to change, move from something that we are now to something else. And the way I put it is that every business is simply trying to get from here to there. The problem is most of them are in denial about where here is, and they have no clarity about what there looks like. How do you get from here to there if you are in denial about where here is and you have no freaking idea about what there looks like? That's like saying if we had some ham, we could have some ham and eggs if we had some eggs. You got nothing.
So I can tell you for certain, Donald, that I'm not an expert on ham and eggs. But what I will say, I'm an expert in one thing, recognizing, because I've certainly been there myself, is that as an entrepreneurial leader, you know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know.
That's right.
And one of the challenges when you don't know where the here is and you don't know where the there is, and you're trying to very often it's a question of, hey, I've built an organization to a certain level and I felt confident and I could do that by myself. And sometimes when you're moving to a larger, more complex stage of your evolution as a company, the risk level goes up hugely because you don't know what you don't know. And when we add the pivot angle to it, it suddenly becomes even riskier. You don't know. And you know, my coaching clients will say, "Oh my God, Randall, I never thought of it that way. Gee, I hadn't thought of it. Oh, gee, that tool is
Magic
really
words,
impressive."
the magic words.
Right. And I absolutely love it. I'll add one other thing. It's not just a question of, when we're talking about pivoting, changing where the there is 20, 30 degrees, 180 degrees somewhere else. It's not just a question of that. Because sometimes, actually, so often, if you're running a successful business, and we talk about doing a strategic pivot proactively, it may very well be that your business is a good business, but you know the future is going to be different. In which case, it's not a question of changing your entire business. You may decide to keep the business as it is and drive costs out of it. Okay, to milk it for as much as it could, while at the same time you're building that second business, the pivoted business at the same time. A great example of that is this. Do people remember writing checks? Right? Some people still write checks. Well, how about the check printing business? If you go back in history, everybody had checks there. If you wanted to pay, and it was as much likely you're going to pay as with a check as opposed to a credit card. Nowadays, who pays by checks? You know, your kid's school might need a check. Okay, maybe you know, your somebody needs a check. It's so rare, and in some countries they've long gotten rid of checks. But the check printing companies realize that, well, you know what? Yeah, we can sell checkbooks and check folios, and we could increase the average amount of sale, but overall that business is going down, 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 down. So the question was there, how do we, when it's become commodified, how do we drive the costs out of it completely drive the costs out of it? Excuse me. While at the same time, perhaps looking for another business. Are we a check printing business, or are we a printing business that just happens to do checks? Are we a check printing business, or are we a printing business that understands financial services? Oh, and then maybe we're a relationship business that is the glue between banks and their customers. And once you start to look at the business in that different kind of way, you realize that yes, you want to pivot to that new promised land at the same time as keeping the base business as it eventually starts to wind down more and more and more and more. So when I'm saying pivot in the context of our conversation today, usually it's not an A or B. Usually there's a little bit of both that happens, because you don't want to say goodbye to all the legacy business and relationships and knowledge and everything. And in fact, that might be the thing that powers the new pivoted business in this particular case. This is the case of proactive. If you're reactive, it's a different story. But that would be my perspective on that.
One of the great ways of changing people's thinking, businesses' thinking, is along that line, is to get them to stop defining themselves by the products and services they've always sold and define themselves by how they help people. My favorite example is ice boxes. the companies that made ice boxes in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that no company that made ice boxes ever made a refrigerator. They all said, we're in the icebox business, sink or swim. And all they had to do was define themselves by how they help people. We are in the business of helping people make food last longer.
I agree, you know, and I can go back into the 1700s and 1800s and give you other examples of that as well. But, you know, the people that made horse and buggies are not today's automakers, just as an example, generally speaking. I think today, for most entrepreneurs, okay, even the question of who do I help today is an interesting one, because who you help today might be different than what you might need to pivot from B2C versus B2B. So if you looked at it only through the lens of who do we help, that might give one dimension, but that might not open the possibility to other dimensions, right? And same thing with respect to if you define yourself as being, well, we're the holders of these patents and this IP. Well, that if you only define yourself that way, then that closes the door to other types of pivoting opportunities, okay, or even just plain strategic opportunities. So I think that when an organization is thinking about pivoting, one of the interesting things to do is to disaggregate the business functions and say, truly, what are we best at doing? And what are the areas where there's going to be more demand for that particular thing or less demand for that particular thing? What are, if we're looking at those weak signals and those changes in the business environment, what are the ones that are likely to be the growth areas, the ones that aren't the growth areas? And sometimes, you know, the answer to this is we've got to make some strategic acquisitions, or, you know, something to free up cash to pay for that pivot. We should get rid of this particular division because, well, it's kind of good, it's not our future. And I think that that's, you know, looking at every one of these dimensions, it suddenly makes it a little bit more open as to what the possibilities are. And then it gets back to the question of, well, what stops or prevents a successful pivot? And I talked about those a little bit near the very beginning, but you know, I'm talking about, you know, senior management that are afraid of change, or they've got the, you know, short-term comp that you know prevents them from wanting to make the change, etc. You know, a board of directors that just wants the status quo as opposed to doing the job and asking some of those tough questions. But it's also other things as well. You know, middle managers who are afraid of cuts and don't want change, or frontline workers who haven't been trained up in whatever that newly pivoted business might actually be, or structural issues. You know, vastly in different internal systems or processes. I used the example before of product or service business becoming a SaaS-oriented business. It's different, and so long as you don't have all these aspects of the business aligned, okay, we made a decision, we're going to pivot. Well, thank you very much. How do you know it? Okay, how do you make sure that all your systems, processes, people are aligned, right? And how do you make sure that that in fact you're making the right decision? Facebook has spent billions and billions and billions building out their metaverse and the hardware and all the software. There are, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of people there. And what's the take up? It's like nobody's there. It's a ghost town, right? So at what point do you decide, hey, we tried this pivot, maybe we got to put our little car in reverse and go back and maybe try a little bit different, right? And so these are the kinds of things that I think are really interesting strategic. If I were to say as a micro business or as a not-for-profit, how do you use these concepts? It's the very same thing. You've got to be aware of the weak signals. You've got to have a strategic planning process that is good. You've got to make sure that the workforce is adept, flexible, agile. It's a learning organization, and you've got to solicit the board of directors or another your partner, your shareholders, whatever it is, to say, okay, so we're gonna do a little bit of a test drive here. We're gonna throw something. We're gonna see if it fits. We're gonna do a little bit of real world market research by doing a beta of something. we're going to do a little bit of real market research. We're just going to talk to our customers. We're going to get their thoughts about whether there'd be some take up with this new idea. We're going to ask them how they're addressing this issue or that issue that you think are those external disruptors, right? And you're going to encourage everyone on your team to say, how do we become more creative? How do we become more innovative? And you're going to train your managers on some basics of some of these things. So it's not expecting people to know how to do things in a vacuum, but building that learning organization, that creative, innovative organization, that when the next big thing happens, whether it's an external such as COVID, or whether it's some crazy competitive thing, or some internal innovation that fundamentally changes what you want, or maybe it's a merger that suddenly your direction has changed, that you've got the ability to actually do it.
I read recently from Adam Grant that when companies go through challenging times, they are less likely to make any significant changes. So obviously there's a psychology at play here. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's wise to batten down the hatches, or is avoiding that risk effectively putting your head in the sand and change needs to be made?
So the question of what you should do during challenging times is really two parts to that particular question. Number one is, in challenging times, is often a cash flow issue, in which case you have to batten down the hatches. You have to make sure that you can make payroll. You got to make sure that you deliver on whatever contracts you've got. You got to make sure that you keep on spending on marketing and all the other things that actually keep the lights on by hopefully addressing what the challenging times are. But what if the challenging times aren't just the usual economic cycle, but it's something a little bit more structural? At that particular time, if you batten down the hatches and just say, well, we're going to pretend that once this storm passes, it'll be back to normal, then you've missed a huge amount of opportunity. And I think one of the things that it's important to do for an organization is to say, okay, is this one of those weak signals that we're actually seeing here? It's not just the usual economic cycle. Maybe it's a signal that says, hey, we've got to look at some different ways of doing things, right? And in which case, it's not a question of battening down the hatches or not. It's a question of being sensitive to, whenever there's change, there's opportunity. So how are we going to take advantage of it? To use some of the words we used earlier, are we creating our future, or are we just responding to it, right? And I think that when there's challenging times, whenever there's change, there's opportunity, so long as you're able to look for it. At the same time, when you've got payroll to make, you got to do whatever you need to do to make sure that your people still get paid.
When it comes to a desire to move towards a new vision for the organization, a new business model, what about when the concept is perhaps significantly different from the current model? In such a situation, perhaps we should really just have a new business, right? What's the difference between the pivot and really effectively what should be a new business?
This is there's various versions of this particular conundrum. On one hand, leaders will say, well, our job here is to change the wheels on the race car while it's in the middle of the race. To change the engines of the airplane while it's still in the air, and we've got passengers, within the plane itself. And in a certain sense, that's kind of what happens when you're doing a pivot, because you have staff, you've got computer systems, you've got contracts, you've got leases, you've got, IT and HR and all the other systems and processes that are necessary. So it's very tempting to say, okay, well, you know what? It is a new business and we've got to retool. And on the other hand, it's also very tempting to say, well, maybe what we should do is we should take a team and move them outside the business, right? So many businesses have said that. We don't want them encumbered by the mothership. We want them to be able to innovate and iterate very quickly so that they can build that new business. And then what we'll do is we'll use the resources of the old one to sort of buttress this new thing. I think also when you say move to a new vision and move to a new business model, the whole question of what's the communication plan internally and externally? What's the impact of the brand? How do we evolve that internally and externally? What changes have to be made to the culture of the organization? by the way, are there some people in the organization, for whatever reason, that shouldn't be that are not part of the future, and there needs to be a change one way or the other. Sometimes the change is, let's look for somebody in that role with a different type of skill. Sometimes it's a question of saying, well, they know the industry, the business exceptionally well. Despite the pivot, we need to use that knowledge internally and move them to an area where they can make a difference, because their current job is not going to be one that's in the future. But the whole communications plan, the whole question of what the impact on the brand is going to be, where you want the brand to be, where it sits in the environment, how you sell, how you deliver, how, if the financing and the cash flows are different, how are you going to manage the financial aspect of it differently? Who, for example, are the new benchmarks that you should be following, outside? Who do you compare yourself to? Because if you're going to pivot, you're going to make a change, you've got this new vision, you've got this new business model even, who's the best of the best? Because in the old one who the best of the best were and what they're doing and everything. How about the new space? So all these things are actually necessary, to be successful when you're making this kind of change. It's not just new business versus old business and everything. It's complex, really is.
You talked about taking out a team and moving them out, not to be encumbered by the mothership. I've heard you advise clients to develop a flanker brand. So there are pros and cons to this. Were there specific circumstances that led you to make that recommendation to develop a flanker brand? And I guess the secondary question would be, why don't we see this more? Or maybe it is happening, but we don't know.
Yeah. So for those who may not have caught that particular conversation in another one of these sessions, a flanker brand is a brand that's separate from the main brand, but uses the infrastructure of the main brand to be successful. And probably in almost every market in the world, the greatest example of the flanker brand is in the mobile market, cell phones. So there's one brand, the main brand, and it's got a pricing model and it's got a target, etc. And the flanker brand is one that maybe pitched at a different price with different attributes of the product or service, etc. And marketed perhaps through different channels, and the customer service might be different online versus with a real person. Like there's all those different things. So that's what a flanker brand is. And the question about whether indeed, does it make sense if you're going to pivot to use a flanker brand strategy? It's kind of a different thing, but what you said, suggested to me that if you wanted to try something out and you knew that you wanted to attack a certain market in a certain type of way, normally a flanker brand is truly built on the systems, processes, etc. of the main brand. And if you're going to pivot the main brand to be something, change the business to be something else, the flanker brand presumably would have to go along with it. But maybe a flanker brand can be something that can allow you to learn about what that pivot might be without actually causing a problem with the main brand itself. So for example, it could very well be that the service angle or the channels or the other partner relationships or the pricing or the service or whatever it is, you can try it in a completely different way because it won't impact the main brand. And if it turns out that there's something there and you've got that product market fit, maybe what you do is you put more resources into flanker brand, or you pivot the flanker brand a little bit more to see if that actually is whether the market will give as well, right? So you could use it. I guess I just hadn't thought of it before. It's a neat idea.
Entrepreneurs have ideas and the moxie to execute those ideas. And you have serial entrepreneurs like yourself that build and sell companies. Not to say the intention is always to sell, but that's always nice. If a leader gets a mindset that it's time to pivot to a new direction, where pulling the reins into saying, are you distracting and putting your efforts not into the current business? Like maybe there's more runway and more success to be had here? Are you like pivoting? Is it a distraction? Like, is it taking away from the focus of the current business?
So oh man, there's so much that you asked there. first of all, it depends on the scale and sophistication of the business from a governance perspective. So if it's a business where the CEO is the 100% shareholder, or the large majority shareholder, they could do whatever they like, right? They don't answer to anybody. They just do what they think. And by the way, that acumen got them from where they were to where they are now. So why wouldn't that acumen be correct in the future? Unfortunately, what typically happens is there's a little bit of ego that sort of goes in there, and you start believing your own stuff. And it may be that now that you've got a much bigger organization, your gut decision to pivot may or may not be the right one, right? And you've got to make sure that you surround yourself with people that might actually pull you back and say, well, if we consider this. Sometimes it's the board of advisors. Sometimes it's somebody like me, a business coach, who can actually help on that. So that's the case of where the governance is exceptionally simple because it's it's a smaller business, or it's a sole shareholder and they hold all the reins, etc. I will say though that if you've got a strong management team, a truly strong management team that you've empowered, and you've made one of those decisions by yourself as opposed to part of them, you'll probably find yourself losing some of your key team members because they're not along for the ride, because they weren't part of that conversation. So, if you're a great leader, of course, you're going to involve your senior team on some of those conversations. In other organizations, bigger ones, a regional partnership, for example, or multinational agencies that's got operations in different areas. There may be a managing partner in every office, etc. The decision to pivot usually involves a conversation at the board. And it's usually part of a strategic planning process. And the reason why is because there's a lot of moving parts here. Different geographies, different business units, contractual obligations with people and outside suppliers. And you can't just pivot on a dime usually for an entire organization. What you can do though is you can say, well, let's do an experiment. Let's try something small. Let's do a proof of concept. Let's do some market research if we don't want to invest in a proof of concept or a pilot of some sort. Let's see if we can get some market traction, some internal buy-in, some champions to make that go. So when you go to the board, or when you have that partners meeting, you can say, here's the evidence and here's the plan, and you've got a business plan that'll say, yeah, this makes sense. And so that would be, the more sophisticated business approach. Now, between those two, okay, the question is, how do you get from one to the other? Because as the business grows, the sophistication grows and the risk grows, and also the opportunity. And by the way, that antenna, listening for the weak signals and being aware of external disruptions, and hopefully if you've got some internal innovation and creativity process in place, there should be things that cause you to say, I wonder if this is a good idea. Okay, and you should go for it. Okay, if that's the culture of the organization, absolutely. But on the other hand, who's going to pay for it? It's not a question of budget, it's a question of priorities, which gets you back to, yeah, go for it. That might be what the gut says. But rarely, unless you're a solopreneur, is it just you. There's clients, there's suppliers, there's contracts, there's technology, there's people all around you. And everything's got to be mostly aligned for you to be successful, or at least for you to start that iterative process to make sure that there's traction and product market fit.
Randall, you're such a team player. You said something that surprised me. You talked about, not just making the decision by yourself, but also including your senior managers so that they're aligned and feel invested in part of the decision. But what about everyone else on the team and other stakeholders? It's not just you and your senior managers. Presumably, Randall, there's other conversations to be had before any decisions are made.
So there's a question of at what point in the process. At the very beginning, there's exploration. One of those senior managers brings up, one of my staff members had noticed such and such. We think there's something there. And the conversation takes place around that table. Or the CEO says, I've spent some time with my business coach. I'm concerned about this particular area. Do we need to make a change in this area? Okay. Or some leaders are a little bit more authoritarian. I want to change this way. Guys, let's talk about how we make this happen. Right. But the conversation has to start somewhere. And after that initial conversation, and the whole question about how confidential it is, because sometimes if it's a very significant pivot, you can't share with everybody because people at the middle tier and the front line have got their own interests, right? In a partnership, they're not partners, but the partners need to make that decision, right? So in the exploration, it may very well be that that might just be at the higher level. If the idea sort of bubbled up from below, which hopefully if you've got a learning organization that understands the importance of innovation, by that time there should be a, I don't call it a business case, but at least something that would allow the conversation to happen at the higher levels in an intelligent way. I think the question about how much you involve everybody is critically important. So once the decision is made, then we go to implementation, and that can't be coming from up top, just up top. I'm talking about that senior leadership team. That's got to involve people from different aspects of the organization, depending on how big the organization is. Right? What's the impact on operations, on sales, on marketing, on finance, on legal, on accounting? Like everybody's got to be part of that process, right? But the actual strategic decision to pivot, okay, the ideas might bubble up from the top, from the bottom, I should say, or they can be brought from the top. The decision happens at the board level, at senior leadership level, but the execution, okay, that happens everywhere, and that's where a lot of that consultation takes place.
So a strategic decision is to be made. The leadership's feeling great about it, but there are some, key people, capable people, people with loyalty in organizational knowledge on the team that's reticent and not so keen with the change. When it comes to making that pivot, do we want everybody, are we swapping out the people that aren't on board, or is it better to have people with that organizational knowledge and stability rather than swap out for new, green, fresh people?
So let me answer that question in a different way. And this is really, exploring the whole concept of change management. There's the people who are the laggards. Okay, oh, I don't want to do that, or it never work. And very oftentimes, whenever there's a change that needs to be implemented, of any kind, people will say, well, we've got to get everybody on board. We got to get it. And these laggards called the bottom 5%, maybe 10%. So much is focused on them that everybody now knows that it's a bad idea. It'll never work, right? And so that obviously makes no sense. So there's the laggards, and then there's this big in the middle, and then there's this group at the top. Maybe it's 5 or 10%. The champions call them. And those champions, those are the people that are gung-ho and keen and have got a stake in it, and they're not the laggards, right? And for them, they're more likely to get something done because they understand why, and they see it's exciting, it's important, it helps them personally as well. And so oftentimes in change management, that we think about doing things generically for everybody, but really it's the top people and the bottom people that we got to be thinking about. And the bottom people we can ignore. Okay, unless they're in a pivotal role, right? If we spend the time at the top, this great group in the middle, they'll say, it worked over there. Maybe it could work with mine area. Gee, it doesn't look so hard after all. This is really exciting because, right? And we start to get these war stories, the water cooler conversations. Remember those water coolers? And all of a sudden, this big group in the middle start to move along as well. And at a certain point, those laggards say, oh, better get on it. And they sort of quickly scurry along because they don't want to be left behind. Now, of course, we could think about the edge case about somebody who's always been disruptive, or maybe this one executive or senior leader who is not in favor of it. And part of the way around that particular issue is to say, listen, we're going to try it over here. We're going to see how it goes. You may be right, senior leader who's very, very negative on the idea, but let's just see. And then can we just get you to agree to, not to sabotage it, right? I don't know if I'd use those words if I was having the one-on-one conversation, but leave it be, and it'll be successful or not on its own merits. And we'll just see what happens. And then all of a sudden, we're going to start to see, hopefully, some traction. And if not, some pivoting, some iterative pivoting. right? And eventually, the people in the middle will realize it's actually not bad. And that one particular executive, that one leader who's been so negative and reticent, the CEO's got a decision to make. Are they capable of change and getting behind this? Or are they not, and they need to be swapped out? And if it turns out that and it's several conversations with this person, right? And it's to say, listen, if you're not behind this new vision, is this really the best place for you to be for the rest of your career, for the next number of years of your career? If it's not, let's talk about what that means. And if it is, okay, my expectation, the CEO should say, is that you're behind this and that you make it positive. You make it successful. And I think that it's very easy for sometimes somebody to say yes, and they do whatever they can, almost passive aggressively to sabotage it. But that's what performance appraisals and leadership bonuses are for. You know, if it's not successful, you're going to feel it, and if it's successful, you're going to do well by it, right? And I think that there's all those dynamics that go into making a particular initiative successful or not. And you know, don't focus on the laggards. Focus on the champions. Create the champions. And maybe if I could add one other thing, it's so important to socialize the issue. Very often, you know, if you spring somebody on something, even if it's the best idea and it's totally in their interest, they might need some sitting in time and to have the conversation and think it out. Because they may know things that you don't know, right? And from your perspective, it's so easy just say, let's just get it done. But sometimes it needs the extra thought. Sometimes it needs to be socialized.
I want to talk about fear of failure. Fear of failure is very real. I read that 30% of North Americans are terrified of failure, and the remaining 70% have fear, though no terror. So fear of failure, is that like a necessary tether to like stand with both feet on the ground? Or is a leap of faith required to become a successful disruptor? Like, how do leaders deal with that fear of failure?
So let's not talk about becoming a disruptor, because I think that's a much bigger question. So let's limit this to being successful, going through a pivot, deciding to pivot, you know, and sort of living that new pivoted world. So it may or may not actually be disruption. It may be just trying to keep ahead. I think fear of failure does two things depending on the person and depending on the people within a particular organization. Number one, it's incredibly motivating, right? If you fail, nobody likes to fail, so you work harder. Okay. With some people, the fear of failure is paralyzing. And the question is, what's the difference between the person who's paralyzed and the person who's energized by it? I'd say it's two things. You know, when we recruit people, are we looking for people who understand how to take that leap and are a little bit, they can be reticent, they could be uncertain, but they know that the journey is what we're looking for, not just the very end. They want to create something, if I could use that word. So and if somebody is the opposite, you probably, I don't know if they're really right for today's organizations where adeptness and agility are really important. Okay, so fine, that's about getting people in the door. But the thing that makes a difference between somebody who is one versus the other is what kind of support you offer them as a leader along the way. If, for example, they get a slap every time something they do is a failure, you're teaching them to say, I better not try anything because it'll be really bad for me. Better not try, better not suggest, better not sort of open my mouth. I better just do it. And that's obviously not right. Okay. On the other hand, if you're encouraging, if things happen, if there's little mistakes, I'm not talking about big mistakes, but little mistakes, you know, to encourage the risk taking, the reasonable risk taking, to encourage innovation and creativity, knowing that not everything's going to land perfectly, but we are iterating and we're doing better and so on. I think the second part of it isn't just the question of management support, but what kind of training you're giving people. Are you training people on creativity? Are you training people on critical thinking? Are you training people how to be a manager? Okay, because if you're able to do these things, it becomes a lot easier for the staff to say, and not just staff at the lowest level, all the way through the organization, to say, okay, you know what, I may have a fear of failure, but it's okay because I understand how to address, how to be successful, how to be more creative, how to do more innovation, how to be more flexible. What does agile mean in the context of my role as a manager? You know, how do I manage this? How do I push my people to do great work to exceed what they thought was their potential, while at the same time, excuse me, making sure the guardrails are on so that they actually achieve what we need to achieve when all this other stuff can happen at the same time. I think fear of failure is real, but we want it to drive great behavior and not stunt it.
Okay, a big topic we picked for today, and we've clearly just scratched the surface. I want to thank you, Randall, for the conversation, and thanks to everyone who joined today and was listening in. If any of the issues we talked about resonate with you, if you're considering a big pivot at your organization and want new perspective, please reach out. We'd be happy to have conversation and learn about your organization and share some resources. If you'd like to get invites to more of these live monthly leadership topic sessions, do reach out, info@randallcraig.com, or follow us on LinkedIn.